I found that one of the hardest things to make is a fitted bodice. Getting it right up close to your body with all of those curves that you have, it's really tricky, especially since everybody is different. And as such, the bodices can sometimes turn out a little off. Such as my first attempt at a Ren Fair bodice. When I first joined the guild, I needed a Ren Fair costume, and so my guild members were very kind. They gave me some fabric, they gave me some patterns, gave me a book, and off I went to make my costume. Yeah, it didn't turn out that great. It was wearable, usable, you know, but it wasn't great. It didn't fit quite right, it didn't look quite right. And so I decided this time I was going to remake that bodice using some of the skills that I've gained in order to make my Ren Fair bodice even better. I started off with using a different pattern. It was from a company that I wasn't really familiar with, but I had it in my stash, it looked good, and I figured this is a good time to give it a chance. Let's see how it does. If anything else, I can make some needed modifications in order to make it work, which turned out to be necessary. Normally, I would go about measuring, taking the paper pattern, trying to get the paper pattern to my size, and then making the mock-up. But this time I decided I wanted to do things a little differently. I wanted to know what would happen if I just made the mock-up as is from the paper pattern and then made the lengthening adjustments on myself from the mock-up. As you can tell, I am very short-waisted. Every pattern needs to be adjusted for me lengthwise, and sometimes it can be very tricky to know where in the pattern to take the length off, especially if the pattern doesn't specifically say take length here, and you're left to guess for yourself. And sometimes taking it off on the pattern has worked well, sometimes it's been kind of a disaster. So for this particular one, I wanted to take the length off from the mock-up so that I could be sure that I was taking it from the correct places. And it was a good thing I did, because it was ginormously long. Not just in the particular length, but the arm side came down very low on me. And so that needed to be taken up too. And I couldn't just take it up at the top because that would affect the back. I had to take it up in between the shoulder and the chest, so that way I could get the arm side in the right place and then take it in the same spot in the back. So it was actually very helpful to do this from the mock-up rather than the paper pattern, because I could make sure those were lined up without having to do a whole lot of measuring to make it happen. After that, it was just a matter of taking it out in the length. I swear, I took out like 5 inches from this thing. It was huge on me, but at the same time, around, it fit pretty well. It was pretty close. Needed little nips and tucks, maybe an inch here and there, but for the most part, it fit pretty well. It was really just the length that needed to be adjusted. Once I got that sewn down, I could do the little bit of fiddly adjusting for going around. I did end up adjusting the angles, in which I took out from the shoulder strap to try to get that arm side to lie flat. That one ended up being a little bit fiddly and fussy throughout this project, but it came together. It came out to work. So now with a mock-up that I was happy with, I took that apart, just cutting it at the seams, putting it on some wrapping paper, because I like the grids on the wrapping paper, and use that to make a nice clean pattern. Then using that pattern to cut out the fashion fabric, the interfacing, and the lining. Now, the interfacing, I had two choices. I could either use a really stiff fabric, such as a duck cloth, or I could go with a fusible interfacing. After some debate, and knowing me, how I tend to get overheated, and I have a really hard time with heat, and it is hot here, I decided I wanted to keep it as thin as possible. And so I went with the fusible interfacing so I could have that thinness to the bodice and have less layers to stand between me and the heat. I started off by ironing the interfacing, and I know a lot of people think you can't iron interfacing, which is unfortunate because anytime you buy it at the store, they immediately fold it and crease it and stuff it in a bag, and you have these awful creases. But if you take some parchment paper, shiny side towards the glue, put the iron on the lowest setting, you can iron those right out. They came right out, didn't impact the glue whatsoever, and the interfacing was good to go. It was time to put it onto the fabric. I did try to cut them fairly close, but I wasn't worried about it being spot on because how I do it, and I know this is probably backwards from other people, but the glue side facing up, putting the fabric on top of it, starting in the middle, and then ironing my way out. And then before I get to the edges, because I don't want glue on my iron, I take that parchment paper, smooth side down towards the glue, and iron it. Same heat, everything. It works perfectly. It doesn't stick to the parchment paper, and then I can just trim those edges right off without any difficulty. So that's a way that you can use that interfacing to make sure you get that nice, smooth finish. Once that was done, it was time to actually get to the sewing part of this sewing video. I attached the sides of the lining to the sides of the outer fabric. So that I could sew in some boning channel. Putting some grommets. And then did a little bit of a fitting. I wanted to make sure that the shoulders lined up where they were supposed to, wanted to make sure that the front lined up where they were supposed to, and yep, they did. Off I went to sew the lining to the outer fabric of the bodice, and do the same thing, adding in a boning channel and grommets, attaching the straps up together. Then it was just a quick run to the craft store because I discovered I had forgotten to get bias tape, and I'm too lazy to make bias tape. I hate making bias tape. So went and stocked up on some bias tape, came back and sewed the bias tape to the neckline and to the arm size. I was ready for the boning. As you can see with my cutting corners in other places, I did use zip tie bonings. And instead of using a file and filing those edges smooth, I just hold them over a little flame. It softens it right up. As long as you don't hold it too long where you end up with big bubbles, it's going to work just fine. I inserted the bones into the boning channels, did the bias tape on the bottom, and I was done. It was just a matter of lacing it up and trying it out. As you can see by these wonderful shots at the Highland Games, well, Renaissance Fair, these particular ones were the Highland Games, and so I added my family tartan to my costume. The fit came out very well. I was very happy with it. I'm so glad that I added in the side openings on this particular bodice, because as soon as I'd finished my lunch, I was feeling a little squeezed, I was feeling a little stuffed and feeling a little bit off, but all it took was taking the bodice off, letting them out at the sides a little bit, and then I was able to put it back on and felt really comfortable once again. So having that ability to have that extra adjustment came in real handy even within that one day. I was glad to have it. So now it is time to clean my workspace so I can get started on the next project. See you next time!